Joining us on the line is Abigail Shrier. She's an award-winning journalist. She's the author of the best-selling book, Irreversible Damage, the transgender craze seducing our daughters. You remember that one? It was banned from Amazon for being true. She has now published a brand new book called Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. Abigail, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So let's talk about bad therapy. Obviously, I think anybody with even a passing knowledge of the psychological industry and psychiatric industry, and it is an industry, looks at the overmedication of our kids and freaks out a little bit. But at the same time, we are told by all of the scientific experts that we're exaggerating the scale of the problem, that everybody who is a kid who's on antidepressants needs the antidepressants. Number one, what are we being told that just isn't true?
Well, first of all, that their solution to a problem they helped create. See, since 1986, every decade has seen a near doubling in expenditure on mental health. And the lion's share of it is going to teens and adolescents and kids. And not only has it not made a dent in the problem, we've seen the problem skyrocket. And that's the opposite of what should happen if these treatments were at all effective. I argue in the book they're counterproductive.
So let's talk about two issues here. One is the problems, and the other is the pseudo-solutions. So when it comes to the problems, obviously we've seen lots of kids reporting anxiety, depression, many, many more than used to report these things. All sorts of mental conditions cropping up for kids, high levels of suicidal ideation and all the rest. So causally, why is that happening now? Why has that accelerated so much over the course of the past couple of decades?
Well, since the 1950s, it's been in constant decline, adolescent mental health. And one of the reasons is we've given kids a really unhealthy life. We gave them, no parental authority. Kids need parental authority. We didn't give them any independence. We give them less and less over the years. We now surveil them in everything that they do, which means that, we're constantly interfering and supervising everything they do, which is the same as adding stress. And we no longer give them relationships, staple relationships over time, like uncles, grandparents, cousins, neighborhood kids, things that turn out to be really important for your happiness overall. And then when they're unhappy, we just pour in mental health resources, expecting it to help. And these kids are flooded. They are getting it in schools, various mental health and accommodation and medication and, referrals for diagnosis. They get it from actual therapists and they get it from their parents who are listening to therapists. And none of it's really what they need. And that's why there's so many bummed out kids.
So that moves us to sort of category two of the last question, which is the pseudo-solution. So we've been told that therapy is helpful, that drugs are helpful, medications are helpful, and presumably in some measure for kids who have really extreme problems, that may be true, but this has been broadly applied to a huge swath of young people. Let's talk about the harms that this brings.
That's right. We're treating the well instead of treating, like you said, the people who actually need it, the kids with anorexia who are really suffering or severe, obsessive compulsive disorder. We're treating the bummed out. We're treating the well. And what that means is we're introducing drugs that do all kinds of things that put kids into basically an emotional snowsuit when they're trying to get used to life. We're putting them on ADHD medications. These are, various forms of speed that can be highly addictive and you require more and more over time. We're not letting these kids get used to the vicissitudes of life. Then they show up at college and they can't cope. And they can't even cope with normal disappointments.
So Abigail, let's talk about psychotropic medication. So a huge number of adults taking it, probably overtaking it by the numbers. When it comes to these medications, first of all, I think that people have a very wrong impression of just how much even the psychiatrists know about the mechanisms by which they work or don't work. The kind of general impression among the public, because this was true until 5 minutes ago, is that you could trust your scientific experts and they actually were going to give you the reality of the situation. And so if they're prescribing you a medication for a psychiatric problem, it's because they know all the mechanisms, they know exactly what it's for, they know exactly how your brain works. The reality is that the amount that scientists know about how the brain works is exorbitantly low, that the medications that do work, very often, some of the things they're being used on are working off-label. For example, there's no medication for obsessive compulsive disorder. There are medications that do work off-label, meaning that's not actually what the medication is prescribed for typically, but it's used off-label for OCD. The scientists or therapists, they might know that it works, but they don't really know how it works. What exactly is happening with these psychotropic medications, and how much should parents be confident that psychiatrists even know what they're doing when they prescribe them?
Gosh, I wish more people knew that. That's exactly right. We actually know very, very little about the brain, and all the serious psychiatrists and neuropsychiatrists will tell you that. We know very little, but most of this stuff is prescribed by pediatricians who know even less about kids' brains. We don't know how SSRIs work. They may just depress all moods. You're giving them a ceiling to how much joy they can feel. At the same time, when you go in there to delete their feelings of sadness, but also they might never learn to cope, and that's what we're seeing. And that's just the psychotropic medications. But then there's the therapeutic interventions, which are their own kind of harm, and they're marching into schools and they're doing these constant focus on your feelings, think about your feelings. And these kids are never able to get past their bad feelings.
And one of the things that's so crazy about that, when you talk about these therapeutic interventions, that is effectively a form of talk therapy. Talk therapy is completely a waste of time. I mean, what the data tend to show is that there are certain types of therapy that actually do work better than others. Cognitive behavioral therapy being the only one that has any sort of robust evidence to support it. The idea being that if you're depressed, then you're talking to a psychologist, and the psychologist will literally say to you, maybe you're not depressed for a good reason. You need to stop the chain of thoughts and actually it's sort of an up by your own bootstraps approach to how emotion is supposed to work. Or there are behaviorist approaches to kids, particularly because they don't have the mental capacity to intervene in their own chain of bad thoughts. If you have a kid who's depressed and the kid is 8 or 9 years old, the kid might not actually have the ability to stop their own mental train of thought and then intervene. And so you actually have to train the kid behaviorally the same way. I mean, for lack of a better analogy, you'd have to train a dog. You actually have to say, okay, you need to get up, you need to run, you need to do certain things physically that are going to stimulate certain responses. Instead, what we've done is we've taken talk therapy, the least useful form of therapy, and we've now applied it, broadly speaking, to tens of millions of kids.
That's right. They call it social emotional learning in school, and they go in and have kids focus on their feelings. But of course, it invariably turns to their bad or sad feelings, because that gives the, school counselor or teacher something to do, something to talk about. So it's constantly asking kids to put a lens to their saddest feelings. Think about a time when you were left out. Think about a time when you were bullied. And it's the opposite of what we would do if we wanted these kids to feel strong and healthy, or even just get through an exam. And as you said, there was research out just last week that dancing does more than antidepressants for mild to moderate depression. It does more than talk therapy. Focusing on kids' sadness and feelings is the opposite of what we've been doing. But for more than a generation, we've been teaching them to do that. And so less than half of the rising generation feels well. They say they're not emotionally healthy or not mentally well.
$20 barely gets you anything these days. You can't even fill your gas tank or get a burger and fries for less than $20. But do you know what $20 will get you? From the cell phone company I use, Pure Talk, you can get unlimited talk, text, and plenty of 5G data for just $20 a month. Pure Talk gives you the same quality of service as your current cell phone provider, but for about half the cost. The average family saves almost $1,000 a year, all with no contracts and no activation fees. You can switch to Pure Talk and keep the phone and phone number you currently use, or you can take advantage of their great deals on the latest iPhones and Androids. Making the switch is incredibly easy. Their U.S. customer service team can help you join Pure Talk in as little as 10 minutes. Choose to spend your hard-earned money with a wireless company that shares your values, supports our military and veterans, creates American jobs, and refuses to advertise on, the fake news networks. Stop spending a ridiculous amount of money on your phone plan. Go to puretalk.com/Shapiro. Right now, my listeners can get an additional 50% off their very first month of coverage. That's puretalk.com/Shapiro. Again, puretalk.com/Shapiro. Go check them out right now. puretalk.com/Shapiro. The giant failure here in all seems to be that we treat children as though they are tiny adults. And so the way that you teach the golden rule to kid is think about a time when you were harmed, and then you should, apply that to other kids, as opposed to the way that you actually teach children, if people who have kids know this, is that it's reward and punishment. It's all carrots and sticks. And that the way that you teach one kid not to hit the other kid is not by explaining, well, wouldn't you feel bad if that happened to you? It would be, you give them a reward when they are good, and then you tell them they're not allowed to do anything when they are bad. And then later they come up with the actual rationale for all of that. But instead, it's kind of the way they teach math in schools now, where instead of teaching you the method that works and later you understand why it works, we try to teach a 5-year-old the method by which you do addition, mentally speaking, and the attempt to rationalize everything as opposed to teaching kids the way that kids need to be taught, which is they learn the rules first and how the behavior ought to work first, and teach them behaviors that get them not depressed first before they start to rationalize all of their emotional pain at 5 years old. It is an amazing failure of adults because, frankly, I think a lot of the adults who made these rules didn't interact with kids very much.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we replaced morality education with empathy. And the problem with empathy is empathy focuses on oneness with another's emotional state. And these kids they're very good at being one with a sufferer's emotional state and requiring others to be one with their emotional state. And it really is a recipe for misery.
So, Abigail, how do we fix all of this? It's so deeply ingrained in pretty much every arena of American life. You talk in Bad Therapy about the fact that it's ingrained in the schools, it's ingrained in the psychological profession. What should parents do when they have a kid who appears troubled, who's having a difficult time in school? What are the methodologies that parents should approach first before they get to any of these things?
Right. So the first thing to do is we need to change our default assumptions. You don't have to assume there's something wrong with your kid's brain or that they need some diagnosis. They might be struggling for something because of something in their environment, anything to do with too much tech or any other, lack of exercise, lack of sleep. There are a million things you can try before you get in there and diagnose a kid, which could forever change the way he or she sees herself. And that's what you don't want. And also, you get these so-called experts out of the way. Stop letting them diagnose our kids. Stop letting them medicate our kids before we figure out what's actually going on and what we might be able to do to help. And we need to stop the focus inward. Get these kids focused outward. They can do literally any activity is better than sitting around thinking about themselves.
It's Abigail Shrier. She writes about things that no one is allowed to write about, but her books are fantastic. Go check out Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up Right Now. Abigail, appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Ben. Take care.
Are you tired of the lies and the twist of the mainstream media talking points? Yeah, me too. Join me in my newest series, Fact, where I dismantle and bring truth to this tiring mainstream agenda.